Welcome back to the Business of Laravel podcast, where I talk with leaders in the Laravel industry and also folks who are working together with Laravel folks. So if it's people who are using Laravel in their company or their company is targeting the Laravel world. Today, I've got Greg joining me. Greg, could you introduce yourself and talk a little bit about who you are, what your background is, and then kind of what company you're working at right now and what Laravel looks like at your company right now?
Yeah, hi, I'm Greg Skerman. I'm the Director of Technology at iSeekplant, which is Australia's largest online construction marketplace. I have been working with Laravel now for probably going on 10 years. And we're a small team based in Brisbane, Australia, and doing some really, really cool things in and around the construction industry, which I know doesn't sound super sexy from the outside, but it's a real deeply challenging space to operate in. So yeah, excited to have a chat. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, of course. And Brisbane, for those who don't know, is where Laracon Australia is going to be. So we're going to be in your stomping grounds. Are you from Brisbane originally, or are you just living there now?
Yeah, no, I'm sort of born and raised. I did a brief stint. Well, I wouldn't say brief. I spent my sort of teenage years in a country town about 100 kilometres away from here. My parents had a small retail business that they moved out there for. But yeah, born in Brisbane, returned to Brisbane after I graduated high school, and have sort of lived here ever since.
Okay, so I am in a Telegram chat right now with all the Laracon Australia speakers, and the majority of them are Australian. And every time I spend some time in the culture of another country, I realize both the things that are extremely similar and the things that people just say casually that mean absolutely nothing to me. And then I know as Americans, one thing, we're always casually referencing a city or a culture or an area of the country that means something to us. It's like shorthand. And everyone else is like, I don't know what you just made that reference to Baltimore. I don't know what that means. And for us, it's like, oh, well, Baltimore. So I know this is not the focus of the podcast, but I got to ask you, as everyone's talking about, Brizzy and all that kind of stuff, and like, where does Brisbane fit within the world of Australia relative to Sydney and other kind of larger cities and relative to other smaller cities? Like, if someone said, I'm from Sydney and I'm moving to Brisbane, or I'm from a country town, I'm moving to Brisbane, or where should I move? How does Brisbane slot in there?
Yeah, I think from memory, I think Brisbane's the third largest. I'd have to check on Wikipedia to be 100% sure, but I think it's the third largest by population in Australia. It's one of the fastest growing cities in Australia. It's like a lot of cities in Brisbane, in Australia rather. It's sort of on the water, so there's a big river that runs through the middle of it, which has featured prominently in Michael's marketing for Laracon. It's, I think, geographically a pretty large city. So it's very sprawled out. So there's the central business district, and then there's sort of suburbs, and it more or less bleeds into a couple of other smaller satellite cities. So there's sort of Ipswich to the west, and the Gold Coast to the south, and the Sunshine Coast to the north of us. I really like it. I mean, I think it's a pretty chilled out sort of city. It's not super busy. It's people aren't sort of always in a hurry, and I don't want to say rude, but I do find that the sort of larger country capitals where a lot of commerce goes on, they tend to be very hustle and bustle, and Brisbane's pretty laid back and chilled. Really great climate. I mean, we have some very hot summers, but climate's like relatively mild. We have wicked summer storms actually, so I hope when you're over here you get to experience one of those. They sort of turn up at about 4.
What kind of?
Yeah, they turn up at about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. They look like the world's going to end, and they go away by about 5 o'clock in the afternoon. So they if you see one, they're pretty thrilling. Wind, rain, hail, lightning, the whole lot. Which is the cost of living in a sort of subtropical temperate sort of latitude, I guess. It's really easy to get around too. Like it's really well transport connected. I was working with Michael, and he was looking at bringing Laracon up here from Sydney, and I think we had a conversation. He was surprised at just how well connected the city used by public transport. So the location for Laracon AU is sort of right in the middle of the city, and there's river ferries that you can use to get across. There's, well connected by trains. We're getting an Olympics in a few years, so there's a lot of there's a lot of investment going into sort of upgrading the infrastructure in the city, which in some cases is sorely needed. So I'm really, as a local, I'm very very pleased that that's happening. I saw that happen with some friends in Sydney for the 2000 Olympics, and it's a great way to sort of level a city up, I think.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. And I live in Atlanta, which, had that same thing happen in the 1990s, and everyone still talks about how, you should have seen that area before the Olympics. So it's familiar. Okay, so thank you for working with me here, even though I know that's not the primary focus. I do want to talk a little bit about your actual responsibility. So you said Director of Technology at iSeekplant. So what does your day-to-day job look like? How much are you in code, reviewing code, supervising folks? How much are you more like kind of doing C-suite conversations, like high, big thinking? Like, what do you actually do day-to-day?
Yeah, so there's a lot of all of that, I guess. Like I sort of mentioned before we started recording, I'm not on the tools as much as I used to be. I came to management via an individual contributor path. I sort of landed ever increasing responsibilities just by being fractionally better than the people around me. So, I'm not by any stretch of the imagination a super skilled engineer, and I sort of lucked my way in a lot of ways into my career path. So, these days, I think some of my colleagues would tell me that I know enough to be very dangerous when I open up PHP Storm.
Yep, there's that level of leadership where they're like, do we want him to open PHP Storm?
So, from a sort of day-to-day management point of view, I sort of have a relatively hands-off management philosophy, the sort of small L leadership approach. I think I have a team of very, very skilled people, and I have found through bitter lessons of experience over the past 7 or 8 years that it's often better to provide guidance and then just get out of people's ways and trust that they'll achieve what you want to achieve. I don't really think that you get, the result might not look quite like what I would have done, but that doesn't matter as long as we have the outcome that we want. So there's high level conversations, lots of whiteboarding, lots of architectural discussions. We have our sort of architecture, is a series of monolithic applications. So, we sort of say it's a service oriented. It's definitely not microservices, but we sort of, we isolate business functions within full stack applications that deal with a particular domain concern. So we might have like an inventory service, which will have an administrative backend. It'll have an API that things can talk to it. It'll have its own database. And a lot of that is around being able to scale the team when we need to, so that people aren't treading on each other's toes. It also allows us to do some really cool things with experimentation. So when we introduced Inertia a few years ago, we sort of introduced it in one service and have a look at what that's doing, and then decide whether or not we spread it across all of the services, or whether or not it sort of becomes an artifact of a thing that we once played around with. So that's really helpful. There are a lot of conversations with non-technical stakeholders in the business. The business, interestingly, doesn't have a technical co-founder, so I wouldn't say that I fill that role, but I definitely sort of guide the founders of the business around the technical strategies that we have in place, looking at things like feasibility, viability, cost. I do a lot of vendor relationship management as well. So I'm not really selling the the management life for people, but there is a lot of talking. So we have some key vendors. We work a lot with AWS. We work a lot with Twilio. Those are probably our two very key vendor relationships. So there's a lot of conversations with them about what's coming down the pipeline for them, and how we can better leverage their services. There's thankfully in my team not a lot of people management, and that's more or less by design. So I think if I often tell people that if you make me manage you, I'm going to be unhappy. I don't like telling people what to do. I don't like disciplining people. And we have a very good engineering culture, and I think the culture within the engineering team takes care of a lot of that for us. So we have no leaners. Everyone's a lifter. I mean, people have bad days or bad weeks. That I think it tends to happen. You can't be 100% on all the time. But generally speaking, everybody makes a really solid contribution, which is wonderful from a leadership point of view, because that sort of yucky part of people management doesn't come up terribly often for me. There is a lot of code review that, as well. We, I guess, somewhat famously deploy very, very frequently. So upwards of 20 times per day being deployed directly into production. They're a fairly sophisticated continuous deployment pipeline. So review is still a major part of what we do. And part of being able to maintain that kind of deployment velocity involves being able to review quickly. So anyone who can understand code and has an opinion on it will get in and have a look at what's going on and make sure that we're not doing silly things. So, yeah.
Okay. There's so many different directions we can go from there, but I think the first one I want to start with is, you said there's not a technical co-founder, but you end up advising leadership on kind of the direction that things are going. And one of the things I'm always curious to talk about is when I talk with folks in this podcast, they are either in leadership because they started leadership, or they're in leadership because somebody else started a thing and they moved up into leadership, or they were hired in leadership. And I found the dynamics of their relationship with Laravel and other tooling is different depending on which one they are. So if someone said, well, I started this thing and I used this Laravel to start this thing and now it's built up, that's one story, but that's not the story that you have, because you weren't a co-founder. Were you the one who brought Laravel to the company? And if so, could you talk a little bit about what was the process like of selling it in to a company that had a different tech stack beforehand? Or if it was already there, did you have to do you have to defend it at any time or anything?
So luckily for me, it was already there. When I took this role, I was in between jobs for a long time, and I'm sort of at the point in my career where I can afford to be relatively picky about where I go when I do decide to move. I was looking for a Laravel job. Wasn't at that time, was not interested in any other sort of tech stack. The business was originally built by an agency, so the business hired an agency to build a typical index.php, search.php, pages.php kind of thing. And my predecessor introduced Laravel 4, I believe. It was fairly long in the tooth when I got there, so we were quite a way behind. And this was all pre-Laravel shift, so upgrades were shockingly bad.
Manual.
Thing. The biggest and most interesting challenge there was that when Laravel was installed, it was overlaid over a legacy database. Sort of Hungarian notation, table names and column names, and relationships were very, very difficult because it was it was very non-standard, and we dealt with that for quite a long time. It's a very large database. It sort of spiders into all sorts of things. And I think largely because of the nature of porting the application from a legacy application to a Laravel application, there were a lot of suboptimal decisions around how that was done. I think that's just inevitable when you run into a problem like that. The biggest challenge was getting business buy-in to do what eventually amounted to a rewrite. It was a progressive rewrite. We did it sort of as a strangler vine sort of thing. Just hacked off one part of the domain at a time and re-implemented that functionality. That has been an ongoing process for at least the last 4 years, and we're still in the weeds on that. And it may never get ultimately finished. It's probably 90% the way there, and that's probably extracting enough value for us. I've been very lucky with the co-founders that I work with. They sort of recognise that this isn't their wheelhouse. So I have been very lucky in that there hasn't been a great deal of resistance or a great deal of need to defend the technical decisions. I think if Laravel wasn't as good at enabling us to do what we do, then there may have been. But as it stands, it's the sort of tech stack we have is so efficient at delivering value for us that that has never really come up. I'm not sure if that maps to experiences that others have had. Yeah.
Yeah. One of the things I talk about people a lot is the need to build the architecture for your application. And just, just as a refresh, like this podcast is not supposed to be about tech. It's supposed to be about business. But the thing is, the people who are making business decisions about how to architect their team often have to think about tech a little bit. So the questions I'm asking you technical are trying to kind of touch into like what decisions are higher level C-suite people having to make. And one of them that comes up often is somebody's trying to make the sale to us that we need to move to microservices. PHP is out of date. We need to do a Go microservice, and there's this, that, and the other. And, and more likely than not that people have, a pretty small number of people in their team and don't even understand why they need microservices in the first place. Before we got on the call, before we were recording, we started to have a little bit of conversation around, like what Laravel does for you there and your service-oriented, non-microservice thing. Can you talk a little bit about that, multiple monolith, service-oriented space that you were talking about at the beginning of the episode? Normally, when people split stuff up in those different domains, it's because they have a whole team of people working on each of them. But I think that your team is smaller than that. Can you talk a little bit about like what motivates the decision to extract like a piece of code into an entirely separate code base, and what are the benefits and costs that come from an organizational perspective, not even necessarily a code perspective, organizationally, interpersonally? What are the benefits and costs that you get from moving one of those domains over to its own kind of standalone monolith?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think one of the things that a lot of people miss when they go to any kind of service-oriented approach is that it is not an architecture that is in service of a technical scaling goal. It's usually in service of a people scaling goal.
Say it again, man. I couldn't agree more. Keep going.
I mean, I've heard it said before that really microservices are more or less a deployment strategy more than a architectural strategy. And you have all of the problems that you have with, an object-oriented application. You just then also introduce a network complexity to the mix. So there are definitely trade-offs in doing it. And for us, there were a few reasons for doing it. One, we were going through some fairly aggressive scaling in terms of the size of the team. And I find when you rapidly increase the size of a team and you don't necessarily allow the dynamics of that team to settle out, it becomes very easy for people to tread on each other's toes. So being able to have a degree of isolation allowed us to accelerate the team growth, because we could sort of, isolate, sort of say, for the next 6 weeks, you're over here. And as long as you agree to communicate with this team over here via this, contract, API contract that we've created, I don't care what you do. You just stay over in your little space. There's other advantages that we find. It's a very, very large code base. So it's, I think at last count, it was something around 1.3 million lines of code, not including vendor, not including tests. So we're talking about, a lot of code, business code. Which you wouldn't, if you went to our website, you wouldn't think that. But there's a lot of, things that happen in the background, administrative tooling, report generation. We have a data lake where we extract information out of all of our databases and consolidate them all for business analysis and so on. I think there does come a point where an application is too big to keep in your head. It's just that the whole thing is just so overwhelming. So the isolation kind of allows us to have applications that are small enough to reason about, which means when we do need to make a change, we can sort of say, and we do a relatively good job of mapping these applications to domain concerns. So we can sort of shortcut the conversation a little bit and go, well, that's a company's concern, so that's going to be the company's service, and you can kind of load that entire context into your head rather than trying to load, what is a very, very large and complicated system into your head. It does have some trade-offs, particularly when you find that a feature or a change has cross-domain, cross-cutting concerns, where it's not just companies, it's communications, or it's not just companies, it's also our rate request system that need to get involved, and that does introduce some complexities. We find that when that happens a lot between sort of like a couplet of services, it probably is an indicator that there's a missing business concept in the middle that could wrap that up. I definitely would caution people against. I think when people do go down the microservice, and we sort of jokingly refer to our services as serverless microliths, they're not really microservices. They're not like a single function deployed to a Lambda. And I think people do reach for that too often, and they split too quickly. So we try and resist the urge to split, and we only split when there's like a very obvious need to do that, because you do introduce this complexity around understanding how the whole thing sort of hangs together. There are other advantages around things like, deployments and isolating databases. It does give you the ability to scale your infrastructure. If you found that sort of one of these services, and we found this from time to time, one of these services is starting to overload the system, it's putting too much contention on a cache server or a database server, we can kind of independently scale that, which gives us like a fine-grained cost control that we might not otherwise have, because it usually is one service that's being sort of overutilized, and it needs a bit of attention from an infrastructure point of view. So there are definitely advantages there, but it is definitely a thing that you should do to proceed. Like, you should proceed with that with caution, I think. And I think when people think microservices, they go, this is what Netflix does, and you are not Netflix. And if you are working for Netflix, then great. They've already solved all these problems. And it's very, very easy to say, just deploy a single function to a Lambda and everything will be great. But they never tell you like the risks and costs of doing that. The other advantage is I think I touched on it, was the sort of ability to experiment. So we like experimenting. We like coming up with new ideas, and often we find that if an individual has an idea, and that idea by its very nature needs to be propagated across the entire system, there can be a lot of resistance to doing that, because you don't know whether the idea is going to be successful. You're doing a very, very large technical lift. Having lots of isolated systems allows us to experiment with new concepts, new patterns, new tooling. Maybe you want to play around with DynamoDB for whatever reason, to scratch an intellectual itch, or to see whether or not it would help with a particular scaling problem. We can do that in isolation in one service, and we get better buy-in that way, because people aren't filled with the fear that they're going to trample across everything. We get to sort of see how it's going to work in a very, very real application that's running in production with real users hitting it, and then use the information we gather from that to decide, do we just leave it there as an artifact of perhaps bad decision that we once made, or do we go all in? And that's what happened with Inertia for us. We looked at Inertia, we thought, this is great. I mean, we're a sort of Laravel React Inertia Tailwind business. We were using React in a very awful way initially. We were sort of bootstrapping React inside of jQuery.
Oh, jeez.
That's a whole thing. This is what you do when you don't know what you're doing. So we thought Inertia might be a really nice solve for us on that, but we didn't just go all in with, dozens of user interfaces moving across to Inertia, because we just weren't sure. So we implemented it in one service, really, really liked the way that it helped our workflow, and then collectively decided, this is the way forward. A counterexample of that, in one of our services, we thought, let's try the sort of domain-driven Laravel, everything in its own folder kind of thing in one service. Maybe that will help us in some way. And we decided that for us it didn't. So there's one of our services that's kind of built that way, and we, in some ways, we leave it there so that we can remind ourselves why we don't want to do it everywhere else.
What I was going to ask you, have you ever, and can you share if so, have you ever tried something that was so bad that not only did you not leave it there, you actually like, we're going to undo everything we just did because it's so bad?
Yeah. I mean, I'm a big fan of always making two-way decisions. I don't like walking through a decision that is irreversible. I'm a big proponent of working in small, reversible steps. So when I mentioned that we sort of deploy upwards of 20 times per day, I mean, the deltas on those changes are usually, 15, 20 lines of code. That's the sort of the size of the increment that the system is almost imperceptible how the changes are happening. They're definitely happening, but they're sort of happening imperceptibly, sort of commit to commit. And because of that, if we do run into a problem that we have an idea, we try something out, we go, oh, this is not such a great idea. We're a handful of git reverts away from like removing that. I can't think of a specific example. I think that tends to happen more when we're making architectural and design decisions around, what's the shape of this code, or are we building something that's ergonomic and maintainable? And I think in a small team, ergonomics are like critically important, which is why something like Laravel is just so good because there's been so much care and attention given to how it feels to use. Like things just it's kind of a bit naff to say, but things just tend to make sense. They just tend to work the way you think they should work. And we try very hard. We're not as good as Taylor, but we try very, very hard to adopt that philosophy with what we're doing. And if we find that we're getting into a rabbit hole where things aren't feeling right, we'll often sort of jettison that and try again.
When you say ergonomics, I think I'm understanding you to mean developer experience.
Yeah.
Okay, got it. I like that phrase. Ergonomics is a nice way to talk about it. Okay, so I'm trying to. There's again, like I said, there's just so many things you talk about that I want to kind of go down those routes. I think the continuous deployment is one where, again, while it's an extremely technical concept, it requires really significant business buy-in. We have so many clients who go 2, 3, 5, 10 weeks between deploys. And we come to them and we say, like when you do that, there's just myriad problems you're introducing into your development process. You're slowing things down. You're introducing conflicts, stuff like that. They're like, yeah, but how do we make it shorter? And we're able to usually help them come down to a couple days or maybe at most like a couple weeks in terms of their timelines. But very few people who don't have the initial intention of their own to deploy that frequently or ever get down to more than one time a day. And I'm always pushing them in that direction. How are you able to make the balance between the technical value of shipping all the time and the business reality of, well, now we got to do feature flags or, now we have to, change the scope of our things? Like, how do you talk the business language around the value of and overcoming the costs of doing these more frequent deploys?
This is a real challenge I find for technical people, speaking for myself here, but I have spoken to a lot of other people who are in the same boat, but technical people who move into management, is that a lot of what we do is just deeply, deeply counterintuitive. Like it just doesn't, on the deployment side of things, it's like deployment is risky. Why would we want to do it more frequently? Because it's less risky to do it more frequently than it is to do it less frequently. But that intuitively, that does not make sense. Like I can understand, I can empathize with people going, that's crazy. Like, when we deploy every 6 months, we have to wipe the team out for 3 days and deal with break fixes for a week on end. Why would you want to do that 20 times a day? It's like, well, because doing it 20 times per day actually mitigates that exact problem. We didn't get to where we were in one step. And this is an interesting conversation I have with people that I speak to off the back of my Laravel AU talk last year, is that, obviously in a 30-minute talk, you don't have a lot of time. It's fairly reductive. So you just go for the headline items. We deploy this frequently. People are like, that's crazy. It's like, well, we didn't get there. We didn't get there all at once. So we were lucky enough to sort of be on Laravel Forge early on, which gives you at least click to deploy, which is, I think is at least essential. If you can't just click a button and deploy your code, get to that point first. Like that I think is crucial. We sort of, I guess, boiled the frog on this. We sort of very, very slowly made it easier and easier and easier and easier to do. And then we got to a point where I think once you can get to a point where you can continuously deploy daily, continuously deploying hourly, it sort of just collapses into that because you've solved all of the problems. I think the key sort of pitch to the business on this, risk of deployment aside, ease of rollback is definitely one of them, because once you've got continuous deployment, you also have the ability to roll back at will. So as soon as you notice there's a problem, a rollback is instantaneous because you just git revert, git commit, pipeline runs, and it's back to the state that it was in before you had a whoopsie. And having that then allows the team to be less risk averse to change. So the team can take, we very rarely have conversations around a change that we feel could be risky, because what's the worst thing that could possibly happen? We have a very small outage in one of our services for a couple of minutes while we wait for it to go back to where it was. So that's one thing. And then the business really likes the velocity of change that we can have. There's a bit of a throwaway phrase that I used to use in meetings, that we can have an idea in the morning and have it in production in the afternoon. And that is for a small team and so for a small team and a small business, that's competitive advantage, right? If you have a competitor who has maybe toiled on a feature for weeks on end to get it out there, and you can have they launch it, and you can have a competitive answer to that sort of in 24 hours. That's that gives you a capability that few have. So yeah, when you're sort of having these conversations with people, yes, it's technical, and it's these things aren't easy. I'm not sitting here saying that it's very, very easy to get to continuous delivery or continuous deployment. But really, the conversation has to be around what is the competitive advantage for the business, for being able to do this. Staff retention is another really big one too. Like people who, I think Charity Majors has said this a few times in her talk. I definitely mentioned it in my talk last year. Is that once people have worked in this kind of way, once people have worked for a team that really performs well, they will be very reluctant to work for a team that doesn't do these things. And because there's so few businesses, particularly in my corner of the world, that are working this way, it's an attractor for talent, and it's also a great way of retaining talent, because who's going to want to go back to FTPing a folder to a shared server somewhere after they've experienced the fact that they can commit the code and then have their work running in production immediately, within a few minutes. It is a journey. You do have to look at things like feature flagging. You do have to balance the sort of engineering decision, which is you kind of want to make deployment an engineering decision, but release still needs to be, in a lot of cases, a business decision, because there's usually a marketing movement that, like a marketing motion that exists particularly when you're doing large feature sets. And you need to align that. So you do need things like feature flags. There's definitely a trade-off there between deployment velocity and the sort of complexity of managing the release of a feature. But a lot of that's a solved problem. I mean, again, Laravel solves a lot of this for you. You've got things like Laravel Pennant, and if that's not good enough, there are plenty of free and relatively affordable tools out there for managed feature flagging and experimentation. And that's the other thing too, is experimentation, right? I mean, once you can isolate a change into sort of two variants and then send half your traffic to one variant and half traffic to another variant, you can make decisions a lot faster, because it's nearly impossible to know whether a feature is going to be successful until you try it. And being able to A/B test or multivariant test a version of a feature to decide where to go next is incredibly powerful. You're not making these very long-term bets around, we're going to deploy in 6 months' time, therefore we've got to fill 6 months of the schedule up, therefore we've got to decide everything today. Yeah. Guaranteed you're going to be wrong in more ways than one when you do that, and then you've wasted 6 months of a very expensive team's time on something that is less successful than you expected it to be. Whereas if you put little tiny micro changes out and then A/B test between the two, that allows you to sort of sense the direction that you should possibly go in. There's definitely business trade-offs or advantages to business in doing that. The challenge for technical people is to keep the technical side of it out. So the advantage for you is that we have lower risk, we have more competitive advantage. We can make smarter decisions by investing in these pipelines.
That's cool. So when it comes to, and I didn't expect us to go down this direction so far, so apologies.
Right.
But when it comes to this A/B testing, do you at iSeekplant, do you have your own internal framework, or are you doing, because a lot of people I know who use A/B testing tools, it's because they're in something like WordPress or something where they're not in control. They can't just throw in a line of code that says 50% of people get this, 50%. Do you have your own internal metrics? Let's say you're going to change how a checkout button works. Do you write a little bit of code and then say, now track the people who get one and people who get other, and see what the amount of money that we convert on one versus the other, and then you track that in your data lake and do it there? Or are you sending that all out to third-party services?
Yeah, we've done it a few ways. Okay. I think the most naive way that you can do this is that you have like an environment variable that switches a flag on or off. And that's the kind of way that you would have done it before Laravel Pennant turned up. Laravel Pennant gives you the sort of all the lottery functions that allow you to say, this user is going into, this group, this user is going into this group, which will get you a reasonable way there. We use a tool at the moment called PostHog, which is sort of billed as a product operating system. So it's not just feature flagging and experimentation. It's also got like a customer data platform, and it's got product analytics and a whole bunch of other things around that. And most of that is sort of handled in the front end. So there's like React libraries that we use to arrange that. But it kind of all more or less boils down to, if name of feature is on, display this, else display this. And then the intricacies of deciding, whether that flag is switched on or off is offloaded to a third-party service, which then, thankfully does all of the student t-testing and all of the statistical analysis that's required to know whether or not a particular feature is a winner or not.
Yeah. Okay. That makes a ton of sense. Because we've got 10 minutes left, I'm going to start into some of the more traditional questions that we ask, even though I can go down this direction forever. You mentioned that you have gone from being an individual contributor programmer to entering a management role. And one of the things I've always wanted to talk about in this podcast is, what does it look like if somebody sees your level of leadership, your level of success, and they are a programmer and they want to get there? So whether it's someone who's a solo founder or someone like you who joined a company at a leadership level from having been a programmer, if somebody wanted to follow in your footsteps, are there books, are there experiences, are there trainings, are there talks, are there articles, are there things that you could share with them? You say, this is what you need to do to kind of get to where I am today.
Yeah, and this is the thing that I wish someone had have told me when I was coming up, because I think there's a lot of people forget that leading people is a skill. They often promote people and expect them, because they're by virtue of being promoted, that they'll be good at it. And the first few years of my leadership experience were not great. I was not a very good, and still don't really consider myself to be a fantastic people person. And I think engineering type people are sort of wired to solve problems in a certain way, and people don't
people don't work.
Those
like
solutions
that.
don't work with people. I think a lot of the focus for me, if I was to give advice to people, and I certainly do give advice to people on this, is that you really need to look at the soft skill side of things, and you need to let go, I think, of the I think we all have our sort of code babies, the things, the ways that we like building things, the ways that we want something to look like when it's done. And you really need to get comfortable with letting that go, because you're not writing it. It's not you that's doing it. There's a really, really great book called Turn the Ship Around. I can't remember the author of it off the top of my head. It's a very, very easy book to read. It's about a US submarine commander who took a very underperforming submarine and turned it into the sort of the best crew in the Navy. And I think I think the model that he applied to that has sort of now been rolled out across the entire submarine fleet. And there's some very, very good things in that book from a management standpoint that I think is worth looking at. So one of them is getting the team comfortable with telling you what they're going to do rather than you telling them what they're going to do. Put the team in charge. And you act as sort of like a backstop. So if someone's got a very silly idea or hasn't considered the risk, you can question them and sort of say, have you thought about what will happen if? As opposed to do this, don't do this, which it's very, very easy, I think, for programmers to think in terms of do this, don't do this, because that's like literally how we write code, right? It's like, if this is true, do it this way. That doesn't apply to people. And I think, if there was one book, I would suggest that everybody, and even individual contributors, I think, should read it, because it's you might be able to convince your boss, if you're having a rough time of it, that they're,
need to give you a little bit of leadership opportunity.
But yeah, I also think too, one of the other things that I've learned over the last few years is that leadership is a choice. Leadership is not a role. The best leaders in businesses are ones who are chosen by their teams. So if you have aspirations for being a leader, just start leading. Just start going first. Start, sort of wearing that hat. Because leadership takes all sorts of forms. It doesn't necessarily mean that you've got a fancy manager title and have positional power within an organization, which is, not all it's cracked up to be, and often not necessary. So, if people do aspire to lead or to have an impact in that space, I would just suggest people to start doing it. And if you're in an organization that won't let you do that, you might be in the wrong organization. It's not, organizations should be breeding leaders, not. And if they're keeping people down and keeping people in their place, then there's plenty of other places out there that will let you thrive.
Yeah. I didn't intend to go about this, but I just remember that when we were talking before, you said something about Laravel as the seventh member of the team, and it was just such a compelling thing that I realized that I wanted to talk about the role that plays, both for like a business decision of choosing to use Laravel, but also even just like the empowerment of the people working on the team. Like, can you talk, because you were just talking right now about empowering the individual members, and I'm realizing that you're like, well, if my job is to build nitty-gritty on the ground queues or build all these rote things or whatever, then I'm less empowered than if my job is to give a feature definition and turn that feature the whole way to reality, and I'm capable of doing it. So could you just talk a little bit about that idea about like what Laravel does specifically for you and your team to allow you to empower people, and also to what impact does it have on team size and team makeup and everything using Laravel versus something else?
Yeah, I think Laravel very much is like the fifth Beatle for us. There's so much work and care has gone into not just Laravel, but the entire Laravel ecosystem. So we're on Laravel Vapor, so that takes care of so much of our infrastructure for us. Like, and all the little details have already been considered for us, so we don't have to be in the weeds around how does Lambda work, and and so there are so many things that all applications have, and I think if you really thought about it, in most cases, 80% of all applications have the same concerns, particularly in the web development space, right? So you're always going to need to send email notifications. You're always going to have to send Slack notifications. You're always going to have something that you can, just because of the nature of the way PHP works, that you can push onto a background queue and process in the background. You're always going to need to be able to route a URL to some piece of functionality. And look, it's possible to go and build all of that stuff, which you can, but it's really not interesting. It's not, the business outcome is not we need a queue, unless you're in the business of selling some queuing solution.
Right.
Like queues and emailers and those kinds of things. Those are not valuable business outcomes at all.
Yeah.
Valuable business outcome is that we need a user to be able to log in and see their dashboard. Well, guess what? Laravel's got you covered on that. It's like literally 3 commands away from like existence, which like it's almost a meme at this point, just how quickly you can set up all and all that. So I think Laravel really helps us because it provides all of the groundwork for you. Like you start a new Laravel application and it's bare of business functionality, but it's rich and deep in like application functionality, like all of the sort of it's like this pick and mix of pieces that every application tends to need. Now you won't use all of it. We don't even use all of it, but chances are it will be there. If it's not there, it'll be in the broader sort of official Laravel ecosystem, and if it's not there, there's going to be a Spartsy package for it. So it really helps us to get out of the implementation weeds of these very low level problems that need to be solved, and just solve business problems. Just build features that that actually put money in the bank.
Yeah. No, that makes a ton of sense. And I mean, it makes sense from a interpersonal perspective about what our experience of like as programmers, and it makes sense from a business perspective in terms of who's working for you and how quickly you can get things pushed out. So I have one final question, but before I get to my one final question, I just want to ask you, is there anything that you would like to share with someone who would love to be in your position, who's still coming up, or somebody who's in your position but needs help getting the company kind of really operating at the same level yours operating it? Is there one kind of piece of advice that you would want to share with anybody who's just kind of like, hey, you know what? Like, Greg, I want what you have in some way, shape, or form. Is there, something they should do, something they should read, somewhere they should go, some talk that's really, because you mentioned kind of that one book that can help you coming up, but is there any other thing that we've missed that we haven't got a chance to get to, or do you feel like you're able to cover it all there?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think I would in a lot of ways mirror some of Aaron Francis's advice and talk to people. Like, I'm relatively old at this point, and I came up in a time when you worked in quiet and didn't sort of talk about it. Not of the Instagram generation, I guess, where brand building is a thing. But there is a community out there, and it's a massive community of people, and there is there's the very public community. There's a very Aaron Francis community, the very sort of Ian Landsman community, Matt Stauffer community out there. But there are people in the community who have specific pockets of knowledge that are sort of a little bit off to the side of what Laravel is. And I think engaging with the community and asking people who have what you think you want, question. I mean, most of us are fairly open to having these conversations. I think it's the answers are all out there. I don't necessarily, there's no. I can't give you like an answer that says this is how you get to where I got to, because I think everyone's journey is going to be very, very different. But I think finding yourself a mentor or finding yourself somebody who will give you half an hour of their time and tell you what it actually is like. Because it often is quite different to what it looks like from the outside, I think.
Yeah. No, I think that's absolutely true. And also just the people who you are idolizing are always just people, across the board. And, you'll meet them and you go, oh, really?
Yeah. Yeah. And some of the nicest people in the world too. Yeah. Like, I mean, we have, our community is we're very lucky. It's a community of very wonderful, supportive people. I speak to Jess Archer a lot. I speak to Aaron Francis, not quite so much as I used to, because he's very, very busy with his new thing. But everyone just seems to have so much time for everybody. And, if you have questions, if you're just starting out or you're at that sort of inflection point in your career where you want to make a change, there are literally hundreds of people out there that you can reach out to and who will happily give you, a moment of their time. So, yeah.
Yeah. I love it. All right. Last question of the day. No, hold on. There's two last ones. First of all, is there anything you want to plug?
Yeah. So, I've spoken a lot about sort of team performance and building a high-performing engineering culture over the last 6 months. I do offer a very select, small number of coaching slots in that space. So, if anybody is interested in getting some of my time to talk about that, or just wants to pay me so that they can tell me how crazy I am, I'm fine with that too. Feel free to reach out to me. I would be remiss if I didn't plug Laracon AU for Michael. I think at the time of recording, he's sold half the tickets already. So
I know, it's amazing.
It's look, I'm very biased because it's my home country and hometown, but I do think it's the best of the Laracons, just because it's just such a chilled out and relaxed time. Get along. Come and see Brisbane, and if you're in town, hit me up. I'm always keen for a cheeky drink or something. If you've got the time.
So Australian of you, a cheeky drink. Love it. All right. My actual last question. If somebody came along today, and I understand as not owner, this is a little bit less legitimate of scenario, but I don't care. If somebody came along and because of your participation in the company offered you $10 million to just walk away and you didn't have to do your job anymore, what would you do tomorrow?
Well, that's a tough one. $10 million is a lot of, particularly if it's US dollars at the moment.
Yeah, 10 million US.
It would be really hard for me personally. I still get very attached to the things that I build. I still think that, we call it engineering, we call it development, we call it all these things. It is fundamentally a creative pursuit. And I find that, and I don't write as much code as I used to, and I've had to get comfortable with this idea of writing code through other people, but there's still an act of creation there. And I don't know that if it was my own thing, I mean, this is a decision that I couldn't possibly make because, I don't own the business, but if it was a business that I did own, and I don't know that I could, because I don't think that I necessarily build to get an exit. I don't think that's kind of in my DNA. I think I built to solve problems that I have, or that people who are important to me have. I'd take an investment, but I don't necessarily think I'd take an exit.
Okay. Somebody offered you $10 million, you'd say, all right, you own X% and let's keep going.
Yeah.
All right.
Do a lot with $10 million.
Yeah, right? Well, Greg, I had a great time getting to know you. Thank you for sharing all this. And I will make sure that all the references, your book, or the book you're talking about and booking stuff like that is all in the show notes. So if people want, and also your Laracon AU talk from last year, they'll all be in the show notes. So if anybody's interested in this stuff, but if anybody does want to get in touch with you or they want to follow up with you, how do they find you?
I'm on the website formerly known as Twitter, I'm at Greg Skerman, and you can also find me on LinkedIn. I think it's Greg-Skerman on LinkedIn.
We'll put you in the show notes too.
Yeah, do that. Those are probably the best ways to get in touch with me.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for your time. Thanks for sharing your learning with us. And everybody else, thanks for hanging out with us.
Thanks for having me on, Matt. It's been a pleasure.